I stand here in the grand ballroom of the Meridian Plaza Hotel, champagne flute balanced perfectly in my manicured hand, watching my husband hold court like he's some kind of tech royalty, while 200 investors and socialites hang on his every word. The crystal chandeliers overhead cast this golden glow across everything, making the whole scene look like something out of a magazine spread. All elegance and power and money. But nobody in this room knows what I know. Nobody suspects that the Louis Vuitton clutch tucked under my arm contains documents that will burn his entire world to ash. They think I'm Madison Hart, the pretty blonde wife who smiles for photos and looks good in Valentino. They have absolutely no idea that for the last 6 months, I've been systematically dismantling everything Marcus built, brick by brick, contract by contract, and tonight is the night I finish what I started. Everyone thought I was just another trophy wife who got lucky when she married the founder of Technova Industries. They had no idea I'd spent half a year learning every loophole in corporate law, every weakness in his company structure, every single mistake he made when he thought I was too stupid to matter, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really began, back when I still believed in us, back before I understood that the man I loved had slowly, methodically turned me into something decorative he kept around to prove his success. Marcus and I met at Stanford 7 years ago when I was 18 and he was 23, both of us hungry and ambitious and convinced we were going to change the world together. I was studying business administration with a minor in finance, pulling straight A's while working 2 campus jobs to keep my scholarship. He was in computer science, always coding something revolutionary, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. We used to study together at the Cardinal Cafe until 2 in the morning, surviving on terrible coffee and those massive chocolate chip cookies they sold at the counter, talking about building something meaningful together. He'd sketch out his ideas for cloud infrastructure software on napkins while I'd run the numbers, figure out the business model, map out potential markets. We were partners, equals, or at least I thought we were. When he dropped out junior year to launch Technova, I didn't hesitate. I left Stanford too, put my MBA dreams on hold, and threw everything I had into helping him build his startup. I was there for the 12-hour days in that cramped office space in Palo Alto. There when we could barely afford ramen from that little place on University Avenue. There when our first investor meeting went so badly that Marcus locked himself in the bathroom for 20 minutes. I wrote the pitch decks, managed the books, scheduled every meeting, and somehow kept us afloat when we had $47 in the business account and rent was due. And when Technova finally took off after our Series B funding, when we moved from that shoebox office to a real building in San Jose, when Marcus started getting invited to conferences and tech summits, I was so proud of what we'd built together that I didn't notice the shift happening right under my nose. The dismissal started small, so subtle I convinced myself I was imagining things. Marcus would be explaining Technova's architecture to investors, and I'd start to add context about our market positioning, and he'd talk right over me like I hadn't spoken. At dinner parties with other tech couples, conversations about business would somehow exclude me, redirect to the other wives discussing Pilates studios and interior designers. When I suggested we hire a new CFO because our financial projections weren't accounting for market volatility, Marcus laughed and said, "That's why we have accountants, babe. Let me handle the business stuff. Let me handle the business stuff." Like I hadn't been handling the business stuff since day one. Like I hadn't built the financial models that got us our seed funding. But I told myself he was stressed, that success was changing him temporarily, that we'd find our way back to being partners once things stabilized. I played the role he seemed to need me to play. I showed up to galas in designer dresses, smiled for Forbes and TechCrunch photographers, let myself be introduced as Marcus Hart's wife instead of Technova's co-founder. I moved into the penthouse he bought in the financial district of San Francisco, decorated it with furniture from Design Within Reach, and pretended that waking up in a king-sized bed overlooking the Bay Bridge made up for the fact that my husband had started introducing me to investors as his good luck charm. My good luck charm. Like I was a rabbit's foot he carried around instead of the woman who'd sacrificed her own ambitions to build his dream. The real turning point came 6 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon in April. Marcus was meeting with potential Series D investors at our penthouse because he liked the power move of conducting business from home, liked showing off the view and the expensive whiskey collection and the wife who could make small talk about nothing. I was supposed to be visible but decorative, present but not participatory. So I excused myself to the kitchen to arrange a cheese board from that overpriced place on Fillmore Street. That's when I heard him through the open door, his voice carrying that casual confidence he used when he thought he was among friends. One of the investors asked about the early days, about how he'd built Technova from nothing, And Marcus launched into this story I'd heard him tell a dozen times, except this version had edited me out completely. In his telling, he'd done everything alone. Bootstrapped genius who'd coded the first version in his dorm room, hustled his way to funding, built the team single-handedly. And when one of the investors said something about having a supportive wife, Marcus laughed and said, "Yeah, Madison's great for the image, keeps things looking good, but let's be honest, she's more decorative than functional. Not exactly working with a high IQ, if you know what I mean." They all laughed. Every single one of them laughed while I stood in my own kitchen with my hand frozen on a block of aged Gruyere, my entire body going cold. Not exactly working with a high IQ. Decorative than functional. 7 years of partnership reduced to a punchline. My intelligence dismissed as casually as someone commenting on the weather. I locked myself in our master bathroom and cried until my eyes swelled and my throat hurt. Mascara running down my face in black streams that I kept wiping away with Italian cotton hand towels that cost more than my monthly expenses used to be. I looked at myself in that enormous mirror with its perfect lighting and barely recognized the woman staring back. When had I become this? When had I traded Madison Chen, who graduated summa cum laude and could negotiate term sheets in her sleep, for Madison Hart, who existed primarily as set dressing for her husband's success? And that's when something inside me shifted, hardened, crystallized into something sharp and purposeful. I washed my face, fixed my makeup, walked back out into that living room, and served those investors cheese and crackers with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. But I wasn't the same woman who'd walked into that kitchen. Something fundamental had broken, and in its place, something colder and more calculating had taken root. Over the next few days, I started paying attention differently, started actually looking at what my life had become instead of the fantasy I'd been telling myself. I noticed how Marcus never asked about my day, never seemed curious about what I did with my time, never suggested I get involved with Technova in any meaningful way, despite the fact that my name was still on the original LLC paperwork from when we'd filed it 7 years ago. I noticed how our friends were really his friends, how our social life revolved entirely around his career, how even our vacations were timed around his conference schedule. And then I found the papers. I wasn't snooping exactly, just looking for our tax returns because I wanted to understand our actual financial situation, but I found them anyway, tucked into a folder in his home office labeled Personal Legal. Divorce papers. Draft divorce papers that his attorney had prepared 3 months earlier, complete with a strategy memo about how to minimize his financial obligation to me. Apparently, there was some clause in the prenup we'd signed years ago when Technova was worth nothing that could be interpreted to exclude me from any equity appreciation if I could be proven to have contributed no material value to the company's success. His lawyer had actually written those words, no material value. The memo went on to detail a plan for how they'd present me publicly as someone who'd contributed nothing, how they'd paint the narrative of Marcus as a self-made genius, and me as someone who'd just been along for the ride. They had a whole communication strategy worked out, talking points prepared, even a suggestion that he start publicly minimizing my involvement in interviews to build the narrative foundation. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to humiliate me, to rewrite our history so completely that nobody would believe I'd ever mattered, and then he was going to leave me with barely enough money to rent a studio apartment in Oakland. That's when I stopped crying and started planning. The next morning, I called my old roommate from Stanford, Jennifer Wong, who'd gone on to become a corporate attorney at Morrison and Associates, one of those big downtown firms that handles complex business litigation. We met for lunch at this quiet Italian place in North Beach where nobody from Marcus's world would think to look, and I laid out everything. Jennifer listened without interrupting while I explained the history, the original LLC documents, the fact that Technova had been built using equipment and resources purchased with our joint credit cards back when we were barely scraping by, the fact that key early decisions had been made from our shared apartment using internet service and utilities I'd paid for, while Marcus focused on coding. When I finished, Jennifer set down her fork and looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. "Madison," she said slowly, "do you understand what you're actually sitting on here?" And that's when I met Margaret Steinberg, 62 years old, senior partner specializing in marital asset dissolution and corporate law. With gray hair she wore in this elegant twist and these sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through all my carefully constructed composure. Margaret took me into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Market Street and proceeded to show me exactly what I'd been too hurt and too distracted to see myself. Technova's entire corporate structure was built on a foundation that included me, whether Marcus remembered it or not. Margaret walked me through it systematically, the way someone trained in law walks through a minefield, carefully pointing out each dangerous element. The original LLC agreement for Technova listed both Marcus and me as founders with equal equity stakes. That was step 1. Step 2 was understanding that even though Marcus had been the primary coder and visionary, the company had been built during our marriage using joint resources, which meant under California community property law, I had a claim to a significant portion of the equity, regardless of what that prenup said. Step 3 was discovering that Marcus had been systematically moving assets around to obscure their origins, creating shell companies, and redirecting revenue streams in ways that looked suspiciously like he was trying to hide marital property from division. She showed me emails between Marcus and his attorney discussing strategy, discussing how to downplay my role, discussing timing that coincided exactly with when he'd started seeing his administrative assistant, this woman named Christina who was 23 and looked like she'd stepped out of a catalog. Margaret leaned back in her ergonomic chair and fixed me with that piercing gaze. "Madison," she said, "I can't tell you what to do here, but I can tell you what your options are. You can file for divorce now, fight him publicly, and probably end up with somewhere between 40 and 60% of Technova, depending on how a judge interprets your contributions. Or," she paused, letting that word hang in the air, "you can be smarter than he's being. You can use the legal structure he's already created against him. The company is worth roughly $480 million based on the last valuation. If you play this right, if you're patient and strategic and willing to do the work, you could walk away with all of it." I sat in that conference room for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching the city below through those massive windows, watching people move through their small lives while I contemplated the restructuring of mine. The rational part of my brain understood that what Margaret was suggesting bordered on ruthless, that it would require me to be cold and calculating and willing to hurt someone I'd once loved more than I'd loved myself. But the other part of me, the part that had been systematically erased from Technova's narrative, the part that had sacrificed her own dreams and career for his, the part that had been called decorative and low IQ and reduced to set dressing, that part was hungry for justice in a way I'd never experienced before. This wasn't about money. I didn't need the money. Technova was already making me wealthy through the stock options Marcus had given me in our early days when he still thought of me as a partner. This was about being seen, about being acknowledged, about refusing to disappear into someone else's story and emerge as a footnote. This was about the fact that he'd spent years carefully reconstructing our narrative to exclude me, and I was going to spend the next several months doing the exact same thing in reverse, except I was going to make sure the world knew the truth. I told Margaret yes. Yes, I want to do this. Yes, I want to learn everything. Yes, I'm ready to become the architect of my own future instead of the decoration in his. That was 6 months ago. That was the moment everything changed. For the next month, I worked with Margaret and her team to understand every aspect of Technova's financial structure. I learned about derivative rights and beneficial ownership and how equity could be traced through multiple corporate entities. I learned about the patents that were technically registered under Marcus's name, but had been developed using resources and infrastructure I'd paid for in our early days. I learned about the client contracts that had been negotiated based on business strategies I'd developed and that carried implicit value that extended far beyond the initial signatures. I learned about board composition and voting rights, and how a majority shareholder with the right legal structure could override almost any decision a CEO tried to make. I hired a forensic accountant named David Cho who worked for this firm called Nexus Financial Investigations, and who looked at the company's books the way a detective looks at a crime scene, finding inconsistencies and irregularities and subtle movements of money that pointed to systematic asset hiding. We found evidence of fake consulting contracts to shell companies, of inflated expense reports, of revenue being diverted away from the main company to entities Marcus controlled. We found proof that Marcus had been planning this for at least 2 years, that his affair wasn't new, that he'd been building his exit strategy long before I found those divorce papers in his office. By July, I had assembled a team of people who understood exactly what I was doing and why, and more importantly, who believed I had a legitimate claim to the company I'd helped build from nothing. The hardest part wasn't the legal work or learning the intricacies of corporate structure. The hardest part was living my life normally, while this knowledge burned inside me like swallowed fire. I had to go to Technova's quarterly board meetings and sit next to Marcus while he presented growth metrics to investors. And I had to smile and nod and pretend everything was fine while I knew I was systematically destroying his empire from the inside. I had to come home to our penthouse and cook dinner while he talked about his day, while he sometimes complimented how good I looked in the dress I was wearing, while he acted like nothing had changed between us even though everything had changed. I had to watch him take calls from Christina and pretend I didn't notice the change in his voice when he spoke to her, the softness he reserved for someone new who he still wanted to impress. The loneliness of that period was almost worse than the betrayal itself. I couldn't tell any of my friends what was happening because Margaret said that confidentiality was critical. That word of mouth could alert Marcus before we were ready. I couldn't confide in my family because they would worry and want to protect me, and possibly do something that might undermine the plan. So I existed in this strange bubble, knowing this enormous secret, building this elaborate structure of revenge and justice and reclamation. And nobody in my real life had any idea what was happening inside my head. I started going to therapy with this woman named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, who worked at the Pacific Heights Wellness Center, and who let me process the anger and the hurt without judging me for the path I was choosing. We talked about the difference between revenge and justice, about whether what I was planning was empowerment or just a different kind of destruction. Dr. Okonkwo never told me not to do it. She just made sure I understood what I was doing and why I was doing it, and she helped me find the emotional framework to do it without losing myself in the process. By September, everything was in place. Margaret had filed preliminary legal documents that would preserve my interest without tipping my hand. David Cho had completed his forensic analysis and put together a report so detailed and so damning that any judge would look at it and understand exactly what Marcus had been trying to do. I'd consulted with a securities attorney named James Park at the firm Westbrook & Associates about the patent issues, and we developed a strategy that would essentially give me control over the most valuable intellectual property Teknova owned. I'd even been meeting with some of Marcus's key employees in secret, letting them know what was coming, giving them the opportunity to understand that things were going to change and that their positions would be secure if they chose to work with me instead of against me. The lead developer of Teknova's core platform was a woman named Sandra Hernandez, who'd been with us since year 3 and who'd been just as systematically minimized by Marcus as I had. She brought me the CFO, a man named Robert Patterson who'd been cooking books at Marcus's instruction and who was terrified of the legal exposure when everything came out. They became my allies, my proof that it wasn't just me seeing the truth of how badly Marcus had corrupted the company. The CEO of our parent investment firm, a woman named Victoria Chen who'd known Marcus for 20 years, also agreed to support me once the truth came out. Not because she liked me particularly, but because she understood that what Marcus had done was wrong, that hiding assets during marriage dissolution was a federal crime, and that Teknova needed new leadership. By the time we reached October, everything was synchronized like a perfectly timed symphony. All I had to do was wait for the anniversary gala. The anniversary gala was Marcus's idea, this elaborate celebration he'd planned for our 10-year anniversary of founding Teknova. He was throwing it at the Meridian Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, spending what probably amounted to $200,000 on catering and entertainment and decorations to celebrate his achievement. And he wanted me there in a designer dress, looking beautiful and supportive, while he accepted congratulations from everyone who mattered in the tech world. He'd invited everyone from our early days, all the investors who'd believed in him, all the employees who'd built the company, all the people in the industry who viewed Teknova as a success story. He wanted the perfect photo for the perfect narrative. He wanted me as window dressing for his moment of triumph, and I was going to give him exactly what he wanted, except I was also going to burn his entire world down while everyone watched. I spent hours with my stylist, Nina Castellano from the Salon Luminescence in the Marina District, getting ready for that evening. She did my hair in these loose waves that fell down my back, highlighted me until I looked luminous in the best light, did my makeup to look natural but absolutely flawless. I put on a custom gown from this boutique designer named Alexander Hale that cost $35,000 and made me look like I'd stepped out of a dream, all silk and diamonds and understated elegance. I looked like the woman Marcus wanted me to be. Perfect. Beautiful. Successful by association. When I looked in the mirror that evening, I didn't see Madison Hart, the decorative wife, anymore. I saw Madison Hart, the architect of her own fate, the woman who'd refused to disappear, the woman who was about to take back everything that had been taken from her. If you're following this story so far, and you're feeling the electricity of what's about to happen, hit that like button and subscribe to see what happens next, because this is the part where everything changes. Click that notification bell so you don't miss the moment she walks into that ballroom and signs the papers that will destroy him. And comment below with what you think she should do. Tell me if you believe in fighting back with intelligence and grace instead of anger and bitterness, because that's what makes this story so incredibly powerful and unbelievably real. Marcus picked me up at 7 o'clock that evening in his Tesla, the car that cost $150,000, and that he'd bought to celebrate the last funding round. He was wearing a Brioni tuxedo that fit him perfectly. His hair had been professionally cut just for this event, and he looked like exactly what he was, a successful tech CEO at the peak of his power. He didn't notice anything different about me as we drove toward the Meridian Plaza, didn't notice that my smile was sharper than usual, or that my hands were steady instead of nervous. He talked about the evening, about how many important people had confirmed attendance, about how this was going to be the most significant moment in Technova's history. He was so focused on his own narrative, so consumed with his own vision of the evening, that he had no capacity to notice that his wife had become a weapon, pointed directly at his heart. We arrived at the hotel at 7:45, early so that Marcus could greet people as they arrived, so that he could control the energy of the room from the beginning. We walked into the grand ballroom of the Meridian Plaza, and it was exactly as I'd imagined it. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like captured stars. The tables were decorated with white roses and gold candles. Champagne fountains flowed in the corners. It was beautiful and extravagant and built entirely on the foundation of a lie. Marcus placed his hand on my lower back and guided me into the room, and I felt the weight of those documents in my clutch like they were burning against my ribs. In just a few hours, I would stand in front of 200 people and sign away his entire empire. In just a few hours, everything he'd built and everything he'd become would be revealed as built on theft and deception and the systematic erasure of the woman who'd made it possible. In just a few hours, he would learn what it felt like to be invisible, to be powerless, to be left with nothing but the ruins of your own arrogance. The speeches started at 8:30, exactly on schedule. Marcus took the stage with this commanding presence that used to make me believe in him, that used to make me feel like I was standing next to someone who could accomplish anything. He thanked the investors, thanked the employees, thanked the board members who'd believed in his vision from the beginning. He told the origin story of Technova in that practiced way he'd perfected over the years. The narrative he'd polished and refined until it was smooth as glass and completely disconnected from the truth. He talked about the late nights in our apartment, the struggles of the early days, the moment when everything clicked and the company started to grow. But in his telling, it was always he who stayed late. It was always he who solved the problems. It was always he who pushed forward while everyone else wanted to quit. He never mentioned that I was the one who'd figured out our first major client pitch by studying their quarterly reports until 3 in the morning. He never mentioned that I was the one who'd negotiated the terms that kept us solvent during our first difficult quarter. He never mentioned that I'd existed at all in any meaningful capacity. And then he got to the part where he talked about his wife, about how grateful he was to have me by his side, how much he appreciated my support. And he smiled that smile that used to make my heart skip a beat, except this time it made my skin crawl, because I understood it for what it was: performance. He talked about how I was his inspiration, his muse, his beautiful companion who made all of this worthwhile. And then he said the thing that everyone was waiting for, the joke that would become infamous, the moment that would be replayed in tech industry gossip for years to come. He said that his greatest achievement wasn't Technova's market valuation, or their innovative platform, or their industry-leading retention rates. His greatest achievement, he said with a laugh, was somehow convincing a woman who was pretty enough to marry anyone to stick with him, even though she probably didn't understand half of what he was talking about at board meetings. He said it like it was endearing. He said it like it was a compliment. The room erupted in laughter. That kind of nervous laughter that happens when someone says something that crosses a line, but everyone's afraid to acknowledge it. I watched the investors exchange glances. I watched some of the women in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats, and I felt something inside me harden into diamond. I stood up slowly, setting down my champagne flute with deliberate care. The room was still buzzing with residual laughter and congratulations, nobody paying particular attention to me as I made my way through the crowd toward the stage. Marcus was still up there, basking in the applause, completely unaware that his wife was walking toward him like a predator. When I reached the stage, I took the microphone from his hand. He thought I was going to say something romantic, something that would play into the narrative he'd just constructed. He was smiling that arrogant smile when I started to speak. My voice came out steady and clear, amplified through the speakers so that everyone in the ballroom could hear every word. I said, "Thank you to my husband for reminding me tonight why I made the right decision 6 months ago." I said, "I want to acknowledge everyone here because what happens in the next few minutes is going to change everything you think you know about Technova." And then I reached into my Louis Vuitton clutch and pulled out the documents that Margaret had prepared, the legal papers that would transfer every asset, every patent, every contract, and every share of Technova directly to me. The room went silent. Actual silence, the kind where you can hear people breathing. Marcus's face went from confused to concerned to absolutely pale in the space of about 5 seconds. I signed the first document right there on the podium, my signature sharp and decisive, and I did it slowly enough that everyone could see exactly what I was doing. I signed the transfer of patents. I signed the documents that confirmed my legal right to the intellectual property that formed the foundation of Technova's entire platform. I signed the papers that made me the majority shareholder. I signed my name onto the future that I'd been promised and then stolen from. Then Margaret walked onto the stage. Margaret Steinberg in her perfectly tailored Armani suit, carrying a folder full of additional documents, and she began to speak into the microphone with the calm authority of someone who'd dismantled corporate empires before breakfast. Margaret explained to everyone in that ballroom exactly what Marcus had been doing. She talked about the shell companies and the hidden assets and the systematic movement of money designed to obscure the origins of Technova's wealth. She presented the forensic accountant's report showing that Marcus had been attempting to hide marital property in violation of California law. She discussed the preliminary legal filings she'd made with the state and the federal authorities investigating potential securities fraud. She outlined the timeline of his affair and his divorce planning that had coincided exactly with attempts to minimize my contributions to the company. And then she did something absolutely brilliant. She called up Sandra Hernandez, the lead developer, and asked her to explain the technical reality of how Technova's core platform had been developed. Sandra walked onto that stage in her jeans and Technova hoodie and talked about how the architecture of our most important product had been built on foundation layers that I'd helped design, how the business strategy that had attracted investors was based on market research I'd conducted, how the company's entire value proposition was constructed on work that predated Marcus's involvement by weeks. She talked about being told not to mention my contributions, about being pressured to validate a narrative that erased me, about the relief she felt knowing that the truth was finally coming out. Then Robert Patterson, the CFO, came up and admitted under the microphone that Marcus had instructed him to manipulate the books, to create false expense reports, to divert revenue in ways designed to hide assets. He talked about the guilt he'd been carrying, about how he'd wanted to do the right thing but had been afraid of the consequences. And finally, Victoria Chen from the investment firm came to the microphone and explained that the board had been notified of the legal situation and that they were supporting the transition of leadership to me, effective immediately. She talked about how Technova needed new direction, better ethics, and a leader who understood the company's true values and its true history. Marcus tried to stand up. He tried to walk to the stage and deny everything, to make some kind of dramatic gesture that would put him back in control of the narrative. Security stopped him. Actual security, because I'd arranged that too, had coordinated with the hotel to ensure that nobody interfered with what was happening. He stood there in his Brioni tuxedo in front of 200 of his most important business associates, and I watched as the realization dawned on his face that he had just lost everything. Not because I hated him, though I did. Not because I wanted revenge in the way that popular movies depict revenge, with screaming and violence and satisfaction, but because I understood something fundamental in that moment, something that would stay with me for years to come. I had the power to choose my own story, and I was choosing to be the hero of it instead of a supporting character in his. The investors started leaving. Some of them stopped to speak to me on their way out, congratulating me in that careful way that people use when they're not entirely sure what they're witnessing, but they understand that the power dynamic has shifted fundamentally. Others avoided eye contact entirely, uncomfortable with the reality of what they'd just learned about Marcus, conflicted about whether they should have seen it coming or whether they'd been intentionally blind to it because Marcus was charming and compelling and easy to believe in. By the time the evening ended, the grand ballroom of the Meridian Plaza had transformed from a celebration of Marcus's triumph into the scene of his complete and utter downfall. The weeks that followed were chaos in the way that fundamental transitions always are. My lawyers filed the official paperwork transferring control of Technova to me. The media picked up the story and exploded with it. Everyone from the San Francisco Chronicle to the Wall Street Journal, writing about the revenge marriage dissolution that had shocked the tech industry. Some articles were sympathetic to me, presenting it as a story of a woman reclaiming her power and her company. Others were critical, calling it ruthless and manipulative, and suggesting that I'd destroyed a man for the crime of not appreciating me. The truth, as always, was more complicated. I hadn't destroyed Marcus. Marcus had destroyed himself through his arrogance and his cruelty and his assumption that he could erase me from the story I'd helped write. I had simply refused to stay erased. The company itself required significant restructuring. I brought in a new management team. People who understood that sustainable growth came from ethical practices and employee satisfaction, not from cutting corners and manipulating assets. I increased salaries across the board, implemented profit-sharing programs that included every employee, and created a company culture that was fundamentally different from the one Marcus had built. I started talking publicly about the early days of Technova, about my contributions, about the importance of acknowledging everyone who helped build something rather than concentrating all the credit in the hands of a single charismatic leader. I didn't do this to humiliate Marcus further. I did it because the narrative mattered, because other women needed to understand that their contributions counted, that they shouldn't disappear themselves for someone else's success, that they deserved to be acknowledged and valued and compensated for what they brought to the table. If you're watching this and you've been thinking about standing up for yourself, about claiming the credit you deserve, about refusing to be written out of your own story, then this is your sign. Hit that like button and subscribe, because these are the kinds of stories we need to hear, the stories about women who understand their own power and aren't afraid to use it. Ring that notification bell and let me know in the comments what you think about choosing intelligence and strategy over anger and bitterness, because that's the real power move in a story like this. 3 months after the gala, I was sitting in the CEO's office at Technova's San Jose headquarters, the same office where Marcus had spent so many years making decisions that affected hundreds of people. The view from the window was exactly the same, showing the same parking lot and the same industrial buildings and the same gray California sky. But everything else had changed. I'd redecorated it, removed all of Marcus's pretentious art, and replaced it with pieces that meant something to me, that reflected who I actually was instead of who I was pretending to be. I'd also completely restructured how decisions were made at Technova, implementing processes that valued input from across the organization instead of concentrating power in the hands of a single person who happened to have technical knowledge and charisma. The company was thriving. Revenue was up. Employee retention was at an all-time high. We were being written about in the business press not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study in organizational transformation and ethical leadership. And I was different too. The revenge had given me something that I hadn't expected. It had given me clarity about my own worth and my own capabilities. I no longer needed Marcus to validate my intelligence or my contributions. I didn't need external confirmation that I mattered because I understood it in my bones. I'd spent years building something and then allowing myself to be erased from the story of my own achievement. I wasn't going to do that anymore. Not with Technova, not with anyone. The transformation didn't happen in a vacuum. I spent significant time in therapy processing what I'd done, examining whether my actions had been justified and necessary, or whether I'd been driven by bitterness in ways I wasn't admitting to myself. Dr. Okonkwo helped me navigate the difference between healthy justice and unhealthy revenge, between claiming what was mine and destroying someone else for the satisfaction of it. We talked about Marcus frequently, about the fact that he'd been broken in a lot of ways, that his arrogance had probably come from insecurity, that his need to minimize me had probably been about his own fears of inadequacy. Understanding that didn't make what he'd done okay, but it helped me forgive myself for what I'd done, helped me understand that justice and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. A year after the gala, I ran into Marcus at a coffee shop in the financial district. He was working for a venture capital firm now, had been demoted from CEO to analyst, and he looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical appearance. He looked at me with this expression of such profound regret that I actually felt a twinge of sympathy. He wanted to talk, wanted to explain himself or apologize or ask me to reconsider in some way, but I didn't have anything left to say to him. I ordered my latte, nodded politely, and left. I'd already told my story. I'd already taken back what was mine. And now I was focused on building something new, something that reflected my values and my vision, something that acknowledged all the people who contributed to it, instead of funneling all the credit toward a single person at the top. 2 years after the anniversary gala, Technova was being valued at nearly $800 million, and we were expanding internationally. I was sitting on the board of 2 other companies, serving as a mentor for female entrepreneurs, and writing about my experience in various business publications. I'd become the kind of person that other women pointed to and said, "That's what it looks like when you refuse to disappear. That's what it looks like when you claim your own power." That's what it looks like when you understand that your intelligence and your work and your contributions matter, and you refuse to let anyone convince you otherwise. The revenge had been necessary, but it wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the woman I'd become in the process. The woman who understood her own worth and who wasn't willing to compromise that for anyone. I'd learned that the best revenge wasn't destroying someone else's life. It was building something better with your own, and that lesson had transformed everything.